The man who won one of the greatest carrier victories of the Pacific was accused of letting an even greater victory escape. Not by the enemy, by officers in his own uniform. Too cautious, they said. Too conservative. A commander who had held the chance of a century in his hands and let it slip through his fingers. One of the most senior aviators in the Pacific wanted him removed from command outright. And here is the strange part, the part that stays with you. The plan the enemy had already set in motion out there in the dark of that very night seemed to anticipate one deep truth about this quiet American that his own critics never gave him credit for. If you had family in the Pacific in those years, a father, an uncle, a grandfather on some gray ship under that enormous sky, then you already know something about this ocean. You know it swallowed men whole, and it did not care about medals, and it did not care who got the headlines back home. This is the story of a man who understood that better than almost anyone, and it begins on a dark bridge in the middle of the night with a single sheet of paper, late night. June 18, 1944. The flag bridge of the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis rides low against a black Pacific swell, somewhere in the vast emptiness the maps call the Philippine Sea. There is no moon worth speaking of, only the dim red glow of the battle lamps, the hum of the ventilation, the creak of steel. And one man standing very still with that single sheet of paper in his hand. The man is Raymond Spruance. He is 57 years old. He is a full admiral, 4 stars, with a date of rank just 4 months old, and he commands one of the most powerful concentrations of naval force ever assembled. And in the next hour, he will make a decision that many of the officers in this fleet will spend the rest of their lives insisting was a mistake. The paper in his hand is a request. It comes from Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, the carrier commander, a man whose professional identity had been shaped by naval aviation almost from its infancy, and who can smell an opportunity the way other men smell rain coming. Mitcher wants permission to take Task Force 58 and turn it west. He wants to run through the darkness, close the distance to the Japanese fleet, and be in position at first light to hurl everything he has at the enemy carriers. It is a serious proposal from a serious officer. Spruance knows exactly how tempting it is. That is precisely what makes this so hard. He reads the message again. Outside the steel, the ocean rolls on, indifferent, enormous, hiding somewhere within it the most dangerous concentration of naval air power the Imperial Japanese Navy has left. Many of the aviators in this fleet feel the same pull Mitcher feels. West, go west, close the range, and Raymond Spruance is about to say no. And he is not saying it into a room that agrees with him. This is no lone dissenter overruling a crowd. Many of the carrier officers want to go west, and several members of Spruance's own staff side with Mitcher. Mitcher himself strongly prefers the western advance, and his disappointment will be unmistakable in the days after the battle. But the disagreement runs both ways, and that is what makes it real. Admiral Willis Lee, who commanded the battleships and who would have had to fight any night engagement, strongly advised against seeking a battle in the dark, citing his crew's lack of recent training in night gunnery. So Spruance stands at the center of a genuine and serious disagreement among capable men, and the decision is his alone. And whatever he decides, some of the finest officers in the United States Navy will believe he decided it wrong. And there is one man far across this dark ocean who has already committed the fate of his fleet to a plan built on guessing how this quiet American will behave. A man named Ozawa. The Japanese admiral on the other side of this very battle, who in a matter of hours will launch 4 waves of aircraft into the morning sky and watch helpless as nearly all of them are torn apart. The plan Ozawa has already set in motion does not require Spruance to make any mistake at all. And strangely enough, it seems to anticipate one important thing about the American commander, that Spruance was unlikely to abandon his beaches for the sake of a reckless pursuit. What that plan reveals about how one professional read another is something we will come back to, because it is the strangest thread in this whole story. To understand the decision, you first have to understand the man, and Raymond Spruance was, by the standards of his own celebrity-hungry Navy, almost invisible on purpose. There is a reference book from that era called Who's Who in America. Nearly every senior officer of the Second World War filled his entry with paragraphs of accomplishment, decorations, commands, the careful architecture of a public reputation. Raymond Spruance's entry was 3 lines long, his name, his rank, 2 bare facts. That was his choice. Reporters came to him throughout the war and after it. They sat across from him, notebooks open, waiting for the quotable line, the flash of ego, the war story that would sell papers. He gave them silence. He would sit, patient and unbothered, answering as briefly as courtesy allowed, until they ran out of questions and left with nothing worth printing. This was not shyness. He was not a timid man. He explained it himself once in a talk at the Naval Academy, and it is one of the most quietly radical things any commander of that era ever said. Personal publicity in war, he warned, can be a genuine danger because it can begin to affect the way a man thinks. A commander's judgment, he said, is at its sharpest when he can forget himself entirely, forget whatever reputation he may have earned, and pour his whole mind into the single task of getting the decision right. Read that again and understand what it means. He was not avoiding the newspapers out of modesty. He was protecting his own mind from his own ego. He had looked at the thing most men crave, fame, recognition, glory, and he had identified it as a threat to clear thinking. So he refused it, deliberately, as a matter of discipline. And here is the contrast that will run underneath this entire story. While Raymond Spruance sat in silence, giving reporters nothing, another American admiral was on the cover of Time magazine. His name was William Halsey. His quotes were printed on recruitment posters. His face was in the papers, bold, aggressive, quotable, the very image of the fighting admiral the public wanted to see. Two admirals, the same ocean, the same war, and two completely different ideas about what a commander owed the public and owed himself. There was a captain named George Dyer who served under both men, and he described the difference in terms any sailor alive would understand instantly. Under Halsey, he said, "You never quite knew what you would be doing 5 minutes from now." There was excitement, unpredictability, the electric sense that anything might happen. Under Spruance, the printed orders were always current, always precise, and you did exactly what they said, and you did it with confidence. One command felt like a thrill, the other felt like certainty. And when your life and your ship depended on it, Dyer knew which one he trusted. Now cross the ocean, because in Tokyo, the Navy had developed its own ideas about how battles should be won. The Imperial Japanese Navy of this era had built its entire strategic imagination around a single dream, the one great decisive battle that would shatter the American fleet in an afternoon and force a favorable peace. Its most celebrated officer, Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had been a national icon. And when he was killed in April of 1943, Japan went into official state mourning, and the officer this Navy now regarded as its finest carrier commander was a man named Jisaburo Ozawa. He was 57 years old, tall, austere, and formidably intelligent, a theorist of carrier warfare who had mastered the science of it from first principles, reasoning his way to the cutting edge of naval aviation, all without ever once flying a plane himself. Understand this clearly, because it matters for everything that follows. The difference between Ozawa and Spruance was not intelligence, and it was not seriousness. Both men were brilliant. Both were careful, lifelong students of naval war. The difference was that the two navies had arrived at different assumptions about how a carrier battle should be fought, and those assumptions shaped every decision each man would make. Ozawa's plan, the one already in motion, was not a fantasy. It was a genuine, logical attempt to win a battle he knew he was outnumbered to fight. It was simply built on capabilities that had quietly eroded beneath him, and he did not yet know how far. But before Raymond Spruance could ever face Ozawa across the Philippine Sea, there was an earlier night, 2 years before, that told you exactly who he was. Remember it, because it is the first time he was condemned for a decision that later looked very different. May of 1942. William Halsey, the aggressive one, the famous one, the natural choice to lead America's carriers in the desperate months after Pearl Harbor, is lying in a hospital bed, struck down not by the enemy but by his own body, a skin condition so severe he physically cannot serve. And Nimitz needs a carrier commander in days for the most important naval operation the United States has attempted since the war began. And Halsey, from that hospital bed, recommends his own replacement. He names Raymond Spruance, not because Spruance is the obvious choice, because he is anything but. Spruance is not an aviator. His entire career has been built in the older world of guns and armor, destroyers and cruisers and battleships. He has never in his life commanded a carrier task force. Halsey names him because the two men have worked side by side for months, and Halsey trusts his judgment above that of any other officer he can name. That recommendation would change the course of Spruance's career, and with it, in ways no one could have imagined that day, the course of the Pacific War. The battle was Midway, and I will not linger on it because it is only the doorway to the story we are here to tell. But watch what he does, because the shape of it will return, larger, when everything is on the line. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Spruance launches his aircraft at long range, a decision that leaves little margin for error. And the American dive bombers catch the Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment for them, in the middle of the complicated cycle of recovering aircraft and preparing further strikes. By afternoon, 4 Japanese fleet carriers are burning on the water, and the tide of the Pacific has turned. And then, that night, with the enemy's carriers destroyed, he does the thing that draws the criticism. He turns his fleet around and pulls east, away from the retreating Japanese, away from the chance to chase down the surviving Japanese surface fleet in the dark. His own staff urges him forward. Critics say it at once, and they say it for years. Too cautious. A great victory left incomplete. But here is what was waiting in that darkness, and Japanese records later proved his fear was not imaginary. Nagumo's surviving surface force, including battleships and heavy cruisers, was steaming east through the night, hoping to force exactly the kind of close-range night gun battle that Spruance wanted to avoid, the kind of fight in which American carriers, their aircraft unable to fly, their hulls thinly armored, would have been in serious danger. Spruance had turned east, away from a fight he had every reason to avoid. Had he continued west that night, as the aggressive instinct demanded, he might have stumbled into a surface action on terms that favored the Japanese. The decision that drew the most criticism may well have been the decision that protected the fleet, and Raymond Spruance did not argue the point. He did not explain himself to the critics. He simply absorbed it and returned to his duty. Hold on to that image, that first quiet night of a hard choice and no explanation offered, because in 2 years it is going to happen again, and the stakes will be higher, and the whole Pacific will be watching. Because on the other side of that same battle, the Imperial Japanese Navy was carrying a lesson it was not yet able to learn. The man who had commanded the Japanese carriers at Midway was Vice Admiral Nagumo, and he was still in command of the carrier force he had led at Pearl Harbor. That earlier triumph had reinforced a deep confidence in a command structure built for meticulously planned offensive operation. Pearl Harbor had been a carefully scripted surprise strike against a fixed sleeping target, and it had rewarded preparation laid down long in advance. Midway would demand something very different. Pearl Harbor had rewarded preparation. Midway punished uncertainty. Nagumo now had to make life and death decisions with incomplete reconnaissance, his aircraft returning overhead and low on fuel, enemy attacks arriving in succession, and no clear picture of where the American carriers actually were. When the decisive moment came, he was caught mid-decision, his aircraft in the middle of being shifted from one kind of mission to another, when the American dive bombers found him. Not cowardice, not stupidity, a commander overtaken by the sheer speed and confusion of a kind of battle that nothing in his experience had prepared him to fight. 2 years later, that very dynamic is about to play out again on the vast stage of the Philippine Sea. But this time the roles will be reversed. This time, the American will be the one who cannot be rushed into a mistake, and the Japanese admiral facing him will be no overtaken Nagumo. This time, the enemy will have done his homework. To understand why Raymond Spruance was about to become one of the most commanders in the Pacific, you have to sit for a moment inside the mind of the man who built the plan. Jisaburo Ozawa knew the numbers, and the numbers were brutal. He commanded 9 aircraft carriers. The Americans had 15. He could put roughly 430 aircraft into the sky. The Americans had over 900. His pilots were young, hastily trained, thrown into the cockpit with a fraction of the flight hours the men they were replacing had once possessed. The American pilots were seasoned, confident, and flying the finest carrier aircraft in the theater. By every measure, a naval officer counts on the eve of battle. Ozawa was outmatched, and he knew it. So he did not build a plan to win through strength. He was far too intelligent for that. He built a plan to win through reach. Here was the one real advantage he possessed. Japanese carrier aircraft had been designed around exceptional range, accepting serious sacrifices in armor and fuel tank protection to achieve it. Range purchased with vulnerability, and Ozawa intended to turn that single quality into a weapon. Now listen closely, because this is the heart of the plan, and it is the exact point where the popular version of this story usually gets it backwards. Ozawa's plan did not depend on Spruance charging west into his arms, just the opposite. Ozawa expected the cautious American, tied to his invasion beaches, to stay close to Saipan. And that was fine. That was the whole idea. Because his aircraft outranged the Americans, Ozawa could launch his strikes from far to the west, from beyond the reach of any American counterpunch. His planes would fly the long distance in, hit the American fleet, and then, instead of turning around and flying all the way back, they would land on the island airfields on Guam and Rota, refuel and rearm on solid ground, and strike again on the way home. Hit the Americans coming and going, while his own carriers stayed safely over the horizon, untouchable. Attack from a distance the other man cannot answer, and never let him lay a glove on your ships. On paper, it was elegant. On paper, it was very nearly beautiful, and it did not require Spruance to do anything foolish at all. It only required the island airfields to be there, intact and waiting, when his exhausted pilots came looking for them. And here is the irony that the careful historians have pointed to ever since. The irony that makes this so much richer than a simple tale of a genius and a fool. In retrospect, Ozawa's plan happened to fit Spruance's cautious temperament remarkably well. It correctly counted on an opponent who would not go charging off and leave his beaches uncovered. And it still could not save him. Because what Ozawa could not see from far out in the western reaches of the Philippine Sea was that the foundation of his beautiful plan had already been knocked out from under him. In the days before the battle, American carrier aircraft had swept the airfields of Guam, Rota, Tinian, and Saipan and had savaged the land-based air power Ozawa was counting on. The island bases were still there, but they were no longer the secure sanctuaries his plan required. Their air strength had been badly reduced, their facilities battered, and American Hellcats would be waiting over the approaches. A crucial part of the whole design had been disrupted before Ozawa ever launched a plane. And through one of those failures of communication that haunt every war, the full extent of that disaster was never clearly reported to him. He was about to send his young pilots out towards solid ground that could no longer safely receive them. Now hold that, and look at what was resting on the other side of the scale, because Spruance was not guessing blindly on that dark bridge. His fear was not invented out of thin air. Captured Japanese planning documents had shown that Japanese naval thinking included the possibility of splitting forces, using a carrier group to lure the main American fleet away while a separate surface force swept around the flank to fall upon the invasion shipping. The end run. It was a documented Japanese concept, and Spruance took it seriously. But here is what he could not know that night, and it is the true drama of his decision. The operation Ozawa was actually running did not contain the end run Spruance feared. There was no flanking surface force creeping around behind him toward the beaches. He was guarding against a danger that was entirely plausible, that fit everything he knew of his enemy, but that on this particular night was not actually coming. And behind him, on the beaches of Saipan, sat the reason he could not afford to guess wrong. More than 70,000 Marine and Army troops of Holland Smith's V Amphibious Corps were ashore, the men of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions and the Army's 27th Infantry Division. They had stormed those beaches on the 15th. Thousands of Marines were already fighting their way inland while the invasion fleet fed ammunition, fuel, food, and men onto the island. And the transports, the vulnerable, thin-skinned ships that carried that lifeline, were still working just offshore. Now Spruance was not leaving Saipan defenseless. Older battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and escort carriers remained in the amphibious area, with Admiral Oldendorf commanding one of the major fire support groups. It was no small force, but it was not Task Force 58, and every officer there knew it. If Spruance took the fast carriers and ran west, and if a Japanese surface force did come around the flank exactly as their own doctrine described, the amphibious force would have been left far more exposed than any commander responsible for those men could stomach. So now, ask yourself the question he was asking, alone in the middle of the night. You have the enemy fleet located, roughly 350 miles to the west. You have a respected carrier commander urging you to attack. You have every aggressive instinct in your fleet pulling you toward the enemy's throat. And you have more than 70,000 men on a beach behind you, trusting that you will not leave them uncovered to chase glory. Go west and strike at the carriers, or stay and shield the men on the sand. There is no clean answer. That is the whole point. That is why 80 years later, this story still refuses to die. Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because I promise you, better men than any of us argued this one both ways. Shortly before midnight on June 18th, the picture sharpened. A radio direction finding fix placed Ozawa's fleet roughly 350 miles to the west-southwest, and Mitcher sent in his request. Let me turn west, let me close the gap through the night. By dawn we can be in range. Arleigh Burke, Mitcher's chief of staff later put the mood of the carrier men into a single unforgettable sentence. "We knew," he said, "that we were going to have hell slugged out of us in the morning, and we knew we couldn't reach them." Sit with that, because it tells you what the aviators believed they were being asked to accept. By choosing not to close the range, Spruance was accepting that the enemy would probably strike first. Spruance held the decision for a long stretch. He did not pace and shout. He simply thought, with that cold, self-erasing clarity he had spent a lifetime building. And here is the part that separates the real Raymond Spruance from the myth, the part that makes him a far more honest and interesting man than any legend. He was not secretly certain he was right. Years later, writing to the historian Samuel Eliot Morison, he admitted it plainly. "Going out after the Japanese and knocking out their carriers," he wrote, "would have been much more satisfying." He could see the case for the other choice. He simply judged that at the beginning of a vital amphibious operation, he could not gamble the men on that beach on it. He weighed the safer course that protected his primary mission against a more aggressive course that might have produced a greater victory, but that also carried greater risk. And he chose the mission. At around midnight, he rejected the proposed change and sent his reasoning to Mitcher, explaining that the change did not appear advisable and that the possibility of an end run by other carrier groups could not be ignored. It was not a curt dismissal. It was a commander explaining a hard call to a disappointed subordinate. And across that same black stretch of ocean, Jisaburo Ozawa had issued a message of his own to his fleet. "This operation," he told them, "has an immense bearing on the fate of the Empire. It is hoped that all forces will do their utmost." He was exactly where he wanted to be, far to the west, ready to launch at dawn from beyond the enemy's reach. And now understand the true shape of that night, because it is not the shape the legend gives it. Task Force 58 was not racing west toward Ozawa, and it was not frozen in place either. It remained near enough to Saipan to cover the invasion while it maneuvered as carriers must, turning into the wind to handle aircraft working through the necessary movements of a fleet at sea. Spruance had chosen his ground, but he had not seized control of the battle. And it is important to be honest about that, because the Japanese, with their long-range scouts and their island bases, actually had a clearer picture of where the Americans were than the Americans had of them. In a real sense, it was Ozawa who would decide when and where the fighting began. Spruance had made the decision that would shape everything, but the first move belonged to the enemy, and at dawn, the enemy made it. June 19, 1944. The sun came up over the Philippine Sea, and Jisaburo Ozawa launched his masterpiece into the morning. He sent his aircraft in 4 separate waves, hundreds of planes climbing into the sky, carrying with them the last best hope of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier arm. This was the moment his entire plan had been building toward, and American radar caught the first wave more than 150 miles out. Understand what that meant. It meant that long before the Japanese pilots could see a single American ship, the Americans could see them coming. It meant there was time, precious, decisive time, to send the Hellcats up, to climb them to altitude, to arrange them in the sky like a waiting wall. By the time Ozawa's young, half-trained pilots arrived over the fleet, the American veterans were already above them, already positioned, with the height and the sun and every advantage on their side. What followed was not a battle in any balanced sense of the word. It was a reckoning. The Hellcats fell on the incoming waves, and the sky filled with tumbling aircraft. Wave after wave came on, and wave after wave came apart. An American pilot, watching the enemy planes come in and fall, said it out loud in words that would outlive him. It was, he said, like an old-time turkey shoot, and the name stuck to the battle forever, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It sounds almost light. It was not. It was the sound of a generation of Japanese naval aviators being swept from the sky. In a single morning, the human cost of a plan whose foundations had already crumbled beneath it. Because here is what Ozawa did not fully grasp, even as it was happening. The reach still worked. His planes really could fly the distance. But the two things that reach depended on had both failed. His pilots did not have the training to survive against those Hellcats, and the island airfields where they were supposed to land and rearm had been battered days before. His young men flew the long, brave distance to Guam and Rota, only to find the ground beneath them a trap, not a haven, with Hellcats waiting over the fields as well. And then, while the slaughter unfolded in the sky, something happened beneath the waves that Ozawa could not see at all. 2 American submarines had slipped in close to the Japanese fleet, silent, patient, waiting in the deep. The first was the USS Albacore. Through her periscope, her crew watched a great carrier steam across their field of fire, a brand new ship, the largest and finest carrier Japan had ever built. Her name was Taiho, and she was Jisaburo Ozawa's flagship, the very deck on which the admiral was standing at that moment, directing his battle. The Albacore fired a spread of torpedoes. One struck home, a single hit. On the flagship, they barely flinched. One torpedo against a ship that size, that new. The damage seemed almost trivial. Her flight deck kept operating. Ozawa remained aboard, still commanding, still confident, but deep inside the wounded ship, unseen, fumes from ruptured fuel lines were beginning to gather in the enclosed spaces below her decks, thickening, spreading, waiting. Hours passed, and then the second submarine struck. The USS Kavala had worked her way into position on the flank of the Japanese fleet, and through her periscope her captain found a target that must have stopped his heart. It was the Shokaku. Not just any carrier, Shokaku, one of the great flat-tops that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor itself, a veteran of nearly every major carrier battle of the war. Now she sat squarely in the Kavala's sights, steaming steadily into the wind to recover her aircraft, unaware. The Kavala fired a full spread. The torpedoes ran straight and true and tore into the veteran carrier's hull. Two of Japan's finest carriers mortally wounded within hours of each other, and the admiral commanding them still did not grasp how completely his day was coming apart. Because this is the cruelest part of the whole morning, the detail that turns Ozawa from a villain into something closer to a tragic figure. As his flagship burned beneath him, as his carriers died and his aircraft fell from the sky, Jisaburo Ozawa believed he was winning. His pilots, young and green and desperate, had radioed back reports of triumph. They claimed to have struck the American carriers, to have set them ablaze, and Ozawa, cut off on his stricken flagship, his communications failing, the smoke thickening around him, had no way to know those reports were fantasy. So he stood on the deck of a doomed ship and imagined a victory that did not exist, while the real battle ground his fleet to nothing all around him. Eventually, the situation aboard the Taiho became impossible. Ozawa first transferred his flag to the heavy cruiser Haguro because the carrier Zuikaku lay too far off to reach easily, and only later shifted his command to Zuikaku. And it was there at last, once the real reports began to reach him, that a devastating picture began to form. His plan had asked the enemy to stay near Saipan, and the enemy had. His pilots had flown exactly as far as he had calculated, and every clever assumption had failed him anyway, because the ground had been cut from under it before the first plane ever left the deck. By nightfall on June 19th, the great Marianas turkey shoot was over, and it had been a catastrophe for Japan. Two of Ozawa's finest carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, were gone, sunk beneath him by American submarines. His carrier air groups had been shattered, hundreds of aircraft and the young men who flew them swept from the sky. And yet the Americans were not finished with him. When the sun rose on June 20th, Ozawa was in retreat to the northwest with 7 carriers still afloat, and he still did not fully understand the scale of what had happened to him. He believed many of his missing aircraft had simply landed on Guam. His surviving pilots still claimed to have sunk American carriers, so he paused to refuel from his tankers and prepared in his own mind to continue the battle. He had no idea that the hunter had already become the hunted, because Mark Mitcher, the aviator who had wanted so badly to go west 2 nights before, was searching for him. All through the morning and into the afternoon of the 20th, American scout planes swept the empty ocean, and it was not until late in the day, around 4 in the afternoon, that a scout from the Enterprise finally found the fleeing Japanese fleet. It was at the very edge of the possible, at the outermost limit of Mitcher's aircraft range. So far away that any pilot who flew the mission would have to strike the enemy and then find his way home in the dark, low on fuel, over a black and empty ocean. Mitcher looked at the distance. He looked at the setting sun, barely more than an hour of daylight left, and with the landings now secure, Spruance gave him permission to take the shot. Mitcher launched them anyway. More than 200 aircraft flew out into the dying day, found the Japanese fleet, and fell upon it. They brushed aside the handful of fighters Ozawa could still put into the air. They sank 2 of Japan's precious fleet oilers, and they tore into the carrier Hio, striking her with bombs and torpedoes until a tremendous blast of leaking aviation fuel, the very same kind of gasoline vapor catastrophe that had doomed the Taiho, tore her open and sent her to the bottom. And that is the moment the reckoning was complete. 6 Japanese carriers remained afloat as the American planes turned for home. But that evening, a dejected staff officer opened Ozawa's flag log and wrote down what was left of the more than 400 aircraft he had launched into that battle. Surviving carrier air power, 35 operational aircraft, 6 carriers still floated. 35 airplanes were all that remained to fly from them. And now the battle produced its finest moment, and it did not come from a gun. More than 200 American pilots were strung out over a black ocean, flying home through total darkness, fuel gauges falling toward empty, and they could not find their carriers. The fleet was blacked out, as it always was at night, hidden from enemy submarines beneath a cloak of darkness. And out there in the dark, American airmen were running dry, one by one, with no way to see the ships that meant survival. Mark Mitcher made his choice in an instant. Turn on the lights. It exposed the fleet to risks that commanders normally went to great lengths to avoid. The danger of lurking submarines, the danger of showing the enemy exactly where you were. But hundreds of his airmen were out there in the darkness trying to find their way home. So Mitcher ordered the fleet to light itself up. Searchlights stabbed straight up into the night sky. Signal lamps blazed. Ships that had spent the entire war hiding in the dark suddenly threw their light upward like a field of lighthouses, beacons calling their lost sons home. Many still had to set their planes down in the black water as the fuel ran out. But because of those lights, because the fleet had risked everything to be seen, boats and destroyers spent the following days combing the sea. And the great majority of those downed airmen were pulled from the water alive and brought home. A night that could have ended in tragedy ended instead in rescue, in men hauled dripping and grateful onto the decks of the ships that had refused to leave them behind. That was the battle, a staggering victory. 3 enemy carriers on the bottom, and Japan's carrier air arm effectively destroyed. Across the 2 days, Japan lost roughly 476 aircraft, and with them a generation of aircrew it could never replace. American aircraft losses, by comparison, were far lighter. And most of those came not from the enemy, but from the darkness and the empty fuel tanks on that final night. By any measure a commander could name, it was one of the most once-in-a-lifetime situations in the entire history of naval warfare. And Raymond Spruance was about to be criticized for it. This is a different kind of turn than the ones before, and you should feel the change in the air because the danger to Spruance's reputation no longer comes from the enemy. It comes from his own side. Within days, a verdict was hardening among an influential group of naval aviators, and it was not simple gratitude. Among the carrier men, there was a real and bitter sense of an opportunity lost. Mitcher's own battle report was blunt about it. The Japanese fleet had escaped. Its ships had gotten away, and to the aviators, letting the enemy fleet escape was not a triumph to celebrate. It was the chance of the century gone. The complaint moved from wardroom to wardroom, and it carried a sharp edge. This is what happens, some said, when you put a man who is not an aviator in command of carriers. And then one senior officer went considerably further than grumbling. Vice Admiral John Towers, the Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet and one of the founding fathers of American naval aviation, urged Nimitz to remove Spruance from command and put himself forward as the man who should replace him. Sit with the enormity of that. A commander wins one of the most lopsided naval victories in American history, and one of the most senior aviators in the Pacific is arguing that he should be relieved. Nimitz did not remove him, but the debate was real, and it was serious, and it was carried on by serious men. And here is the part the legend leaves out, the part that makes Raymond Spruance more admirable, not less. The debate never fully ended, and Spruance himself never pretended it should have. He always maintained he had made the right decision for the mission he had been given, the protection of that invasion. But he was honest enough to acknowledge, in his own words after the war, that a straight blow at the Japanese carriers might have produced a more satisfying result. He did not spend his life insisting he had been secretly perfectly right. He had made a choice between his mission and a greater prize. He had chosen his mission, he had won an enormous victory, and he lived the rest of his days without ever fully silencing the quiet question of whether he might have won even more. That is not the story of an infallible genius. That is the story of a mature commander who could carry an unresolved question for the rest of his life without letting it curdle into bitterness. And there was one man who came to say plainly that he had gotten it right. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, the single most powerful officer in the United States Navy, a man famous for his ferocity and famous for almost never offering praise, backed Spruance's decision. Spruance had protected what he had been ordered to protect, and he had shattered the enemy's carrier aviation in the process. Whatever the aviators wished had happened, the man at the very top of the Navy judged that Spruance had done his job, and done it well. Now cross the oceans one last time to the other side of that ruined battle. Gisaburo Ozawa's battered force refueled at Okinawa, and then, on Toyoda's orders, withdrew toward the home waters of the inland sea. And when the reckoning came, Ozawa did something that tells you everything about the kind of officer he was. He offered to resign. He took responsibility for the disaster he had presided over, and Toyoda, the fleet commander, would not accept it, telling him that the responsibility for the defeat lay higher up than Ozawa. And Ozawa did not argue, and he did not reach for excuses. He understood what had happened to him better than anyone. He had planned a careful battle, one that even counted correctly on his opponent's caution. And he had still been destroyed because the tools his plan required, the trained pilots and the intact island airfields, had been broken before he ever committed them. He brought 6 carriers home, but in the only sense that mattered, they were no longer carriers. They were flight decks without an air arm, 6 enormous ghosts, and yet Japan could not bring itself to admit the full scale of the loss. And so those hollow ships stayed on the books, still listed in the order of battle, still counted as a fleet. And 4 months later, those very ghosts would sail again. And what happened then would cast the sharpest possible light on the choice Raymond Spruance had made in June. October 1944, Leyte Gulf. The Americans return to the Philippines, and the Imperial Japanese Navy commits much of its remaining battle fleet to one last desperate throw. And this is where the 2 stories rhyme, and where the difference between 2 American admirals is laid bare for history. 4 months after Spruance had guarded so carefully against it, the kind of nightmare he had feared in June became terrifyingly real. Japan's plan at Leyte was, at last, the very trap Spruance had imagined. Draw the powerful American carrier fleet away to the north, and while it is gone, send a battleship force through the back door to fall upon the invasion shipping. And to serve as the bait, Japan sent north the only thing it had left that still looked dangerous on a radar screen: Ozawa's hollow carriers. This time, at last, those empty decks really were the lure. Their entire purpose was to be seen, to be chased, to pull the American fleet out of position. And the American commander in the north was not Raymond Spruance. It was William Halsey. Halsey saw the carriers, and Halsey went after them, north, at full speed with everything he had, exactly as the Japanese hoped. He did not leave his fast battleships to guard the strait behind him. And through that open back door, the San Bernardino Strait, came a powerful Japanese surface force led by the giant battleship Yamato. Its even larger sister, the monstrous Musashi, was no longer with it, sunk by American aircraft in the Sibuyan Sea the day before. But what remained was still a force of terrible power. The escort carriers of a small American task unit turned away under fire while their tiny screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts did something close to suicidal. They turned toward that Japanese battle line and attacked, in one of the most desperate and heroic actions of the entire Pacific War, buying time with their own lives. Do you see it now? Do you see the terrible symmetry of it? In June, Spruance had imagined this exact nightmare, an enemy force slipping around his flank to reach the invasion. And he had refused to leave the door open, even when it cost him the chance to chase the carriers. In October, that nightmare came true, because a different admiral did leave the door open, and out of that crisis came one of the most famous messages in all of naval history. And it is worth telling correctly, because the truth is more human and more painful than the legend. As disaster loomed off the beaches, Admiral Nimitz, back at Pearl Harbor, needed to know where Halsey's battleships had gone. So he sent a simple query: where is Task Force 34? But in that era, coded messages were wrapped in meaningless padding, nonsense phrases added at the front and back to confuse enemy code breakers, phrases that were supposed to be stripped off before the message ever reached the man it was meant for. For the trailing padding on this one, a communications officer added a phrase that echoed a line from an old Tennyson poem: "The world wonders." It was never written by Nimitz. It was never meant for Halsey's eyes. It was supposed to disappear before the message ever reached him, but through a failure in handling, it was left attached. And so what landed in front of William Halsey read: where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. Halsey read those last 3 words as a savage, sarcastic rebuke from his commander in front of his own staff. He is said to have thrown his hat to the deck in fury until his chief of staff took him by the arm and told him to pull himself together. 3 words of meaningless padding mistaken for the judgment of history. No such message, real or accidental, was ever sent to Raymond Spruance. He had made sure of that in June, on a dark bridge, with a single sheet of paper, when he refused to leave open the very door the enemy was hoping to find unguarded. And so we come to the strangest truth of this whole story, the one worth holding on to. Jisaburo Ozawa was a serious professional, and the plan he built in June counted correctly on Raymond Spruance's caution. And it did not save him, because reading a man's temperament is not the same as controlling the battlefield. And Ozawa's own tools had been shattered before the fighting began. Spruance, for his part, was not a man who saw through every enemy scheme. He spent much of those 2 days uncertain, guarding against a flanking attack that never actually came. What he had was not perfect foresight. What he had was the discipline to know what his mission was, and the strength to hold to it when every glittering temptation and every aggressive voice around him urged him to let it go. He was not right about everything. He was right about the thing that mattered most that week, and he was humble enough ever after to admit the cost of even a correct decision. After the war, Raymond Spruance did what Raymond Spruance always did. He faded deliberately into the quiet. He served as president of the Naval War College. He served as the United States ambassador to the Philippines. And then he went home to Pebble Beach, California, and settled into a remarkably ordinary life. He wore old khakis and worn work shoes. He took long walks, often covering miles along the Monterey coast, with a little schnauzer named Peter, a familiar companion, at his side. He tended his garden and his greenhouse. Even his pleasures were simple: the walking, the gardening, the hot chocolate he was known to enjoy. Reporters still called, now and then, and he handled them exactly as he always had, with courtesy, with brevity, and with nothing quotable. He wrote no memoir. He made no career out of retelling his victories. He let it all stand unanswered, the way he had let everything stand. There was the matter of the 5-star rank, the nation's highest naval grade, Fleet Admiral. It went to William Halsey. It did not go to Raymond Spruance, and when the question came up, Spruance addressed it just once, in a letter in 1965, and it deserves to be read slowly. If he could have received the 5th star alongside Bill Halsey, he said, that would have been fine. But if he had received it instead of Halsey, he would have been very unhappy about it. That is not a bitter man. That is not resentment dressed up as grace. That is a man who had made his peace long ago with the difference between what he had done and what the world chose to reward. Even Ernest King seemed to understand it. When King weighed the candidates for that 5th star, he acknowledged Halsey's errors of judgment, including the near disaster at Leyte Gulf. And of Spruance, he offered a single, quiet verdict that when it came to brains, Spruance was the best man in every way. Halsey's seniority favored him, though, as did his enormous public stature and the political support behind him. Spruance, brilliant but publicity-shy, was the junior man. The star went to Halsey. Nimitz understood what had happened, and Nimitz refused to let it go. All through the 1950s, while Spruance was very much alive, Nimitz pressed, repeatedly and without success, for his old subordinate to receive the 5th star his record had earned. It never came. Samuel Eliot Morison, the official historian of the United States Navy in the Second World War, rendered his own verdict, and he did not hand the highest praise to Halsey. He judged Spruance one of the greatest admirals in American naval history, and the argument did not die with the men who fought the war. In 2001, legislation to promote Spruance failed to advance in Congress. 20 years later, in 2021, the case was still being made, argued once again in the pages of the Naval Institute's own journal by an officer who believed, as many still do, that Spruance's record placed him among the immortals. The rank never came while he lived. Perhaps the irony would have suited him. Raymond Spruance had never been the right kind of famous, and he had understood that about himself, and made his peace with it long before anyone else ever had to explain it to him. On the other side of the world, Jisaburo Ozawa lived on until 1966, and whenever he spoke of that battle, he described his plan honestly, as an attempt to fight from beyond the enemy's reach that had failed when the ground gave way beneath it. He never claimed bad luck. He had understood from the beginning exactly what he had lost and why. Raymond Spruance was born on the 3rd of July, 1886. He died on the 13th of December, 1969, in that quiet house at Pebble Beach. He lies buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California, just south of the San Francisco he loved, beside his old commander and friend Chester Nimitz. The Navy later named an entire class of 31 destroyers in his honor. And I want to leave you with the picture that stays with me, because it is the truest thing in this whole story. Not the burning carriers, not the medals he never got. Just an old man in worn khakis, walking for miles along the Monterey coast at first light. A little dog trotting at his heel, the Pacific he had once commanded rolling gray and endless beside him. Perhaps passing people who had no idea that the quiet old man beside them had once held the fate of that ocean in his hands, made the hardest call of his life, and carried both the victory and the lingering question of it for the rest of his days, without ever once asking for the credit. So I will leave you with this. If your father, your grandfather, an uncle, anyone in your family served in the Pacific on any ship, in any uniform, in any branch, leave their name in the comments below. Do not just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them, one thing they did, one thing they said, one thing you still remember. Because the men who were there deserve far more than a name in some database. They deserve to be remembered as people. And as long as we are still willing to speak their names and tell their stories, they are never truly gone.